During his 15-year for faith and conscience as a faith-based peace activist, Thad has faced 1 IRS hearing, 1 bank account seizure, 3 wage garnishments, multiple arrests, and risk of imprisonment. A Texas elector for Ralph Nader. He's a left-leaning political independent that has not voted for a Republican or a Democrat presidential candidate since 1988. He has been a long-time member of the Veterans for Peace and Pax Christi. He currently serves as director for the Institute to Honor Freedom and Conscience, a commissioner for the Truth Commission on Conscience and War, and co-founder StandWithHonor.com on the planning committee for the Under the Hood Cafe, and as a commissioner for the Truth Commission on Conscience and War, a co-founder with StandWithHonor.com. Ladies and gentlemen, warrior for conscience, Thad Crouch.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you for this warm welcome. I have to tell you, it's really great to be applauded here. You should have seen the faces of some of my liberal peace activist friends when I told them I was speaking at a tea party about war tax resistance. They said, Thad, be sure you have an exit strategy. And I find myself surrounded by good people, by good people. You know, I grew up being told a story about America that was a story about freedom. How many people here love freedom? I'm beginning to discover that the story of America is also a story about conscience. The pilgrims who came here could not, in good conscience, worship the official state religions from which they came. And so they came here for freedom of religion, which is a freedom of conscience. George Washington became a British traitor because in his conscience, he stood for democracy, he stood for freedom, he stood for independence. He was willing to be labeled as disloyal to the military in which he once served. How many people here are veterans? Raise your hand. What would it be like for your brothers to tell you you've betrayed them if you stood for your values? I imagine that may have happened to Washington. And it's happening to some of our troops now. You know, we may all have different faith traditions, but in my faith tradition, there's also stories of people standing for conscience. There were midwives who refused to kill infant boys when they were ordered by Pharaoh. There was Daniel, who did not wait for Nebuchadnezzar to change the law so he could worship his God and not the king. He followed his conscience. And someone you may have heard of by the name of Jesus is someone who, when I read the Gospels, I see this man as someone who time and time and time again, when he has to choose between obeying the authorities and acting out of love on conscience, again and again he breaks the law to do the most loving thing. Yeah. You don't hear that very often. But that's what's going on. There's also a place where the tradition of our country and the tradition of my faith stories intersect with Rosa Parks, with Dr. King, with people standing up for their conscience against authority, for freedom for everyone. Who here is for freedom for everyone? You know, and even though I'm the pacifist liberal here, I want to tell you that I honor the people who stood by their conscience against fascism and risked their lives on the beaches of Normandy for freedom. Woo! Because the struggle for freedom goes beyond the circles we draw around ourselves with our political ideals. It is a human experience to struggle against domination for freedom. It goes beyond our nation. It goes to Gandhi struggling non-violently in the face of violence against the British Empire. It goes to Augusto Sandino, a Nicaraguan guerrilla leader who in the early part of the 20th century stood for the same freedoms that our founders stood for. And he wrote a letter to the White House in Washington reminding them of the troops of George Washington who stained the snow red with their blood for freedom, and how it is that our nation forgets its ideals of freedom in our foreign policy to dominate others. Some of my friends said, you better not say that at the Tea Party, Thad. It might be risky. Let me tell you what was riskier. What was riskier was when I put my identity and my pride of being a military veteran and discovered that I had been training death squads in Latin America who killed their own civilians, struggling for the freedoms that we enjoy, that we fight for to keep. My heart wanted to vomit when I thought people I would have died for and killed for were misusing me. And that, my brothers and sisters, is nothing compared to the moral injury being done to our men and women in uniform right now, being forced, many of them, to serve against their consciences for wars that in their hearts many of them know are illegal,
Excuse me, we have
immoral.
voluntary force these days. No one's forced to do anything. They're voluntary.
They're volunteers. Once they volunteer, they're forced. I'll be happy to talk to you in just a second.
Don't interrupt me. Don't be rude.
So there are folks who come to a change in conscience while they're in the military. And if they can go through the red tape and the hoops, they can legally get out. They can say, hey, I can't kill anymore, or I believe that Jesus said love your enemies and I can't do this. And if the military approves of it, they can get out. It doesn't work that way with taxes, my friends. We may all have different beliefs and different values, but in my conscience, I take loving my enemies very seriously. And the money that I earn, or the paper that's supposed to represent the money that I earn, I spend my life energy to get that money. And so what I do with that money is what I do with my life's energy. So could it be that what we do with our money is a spiritual decision? Could it be that our tax dollars are being drafted to fight illegal, immoral, unconstitutional, unjust, and inhumane wars?
Yes.
And that our freedom to not pay for that is denied. You know, there are a lot of things that need to happen for there to be peace and security. And I believe that one of the ingredients necessary for peace is that it has to be legal not to participate in violence.
Yeah.
And you might disagree with my stand, but if you stand for freedom, I'd like you to consider this. How will we ever have peace when it's against the law to earn a living and not pay for war? There are all kinds of institutions, of congregations, hell, we've got a constitution that says when it's right and when it's wrong to go to war. And if you're in the military and say you're Catholic and the Vatican says the war in Iraq is unjust, if you wanted to say, hey, you know what? I am willing to risk my life for America, but I cannot in good conscience and in my faith take part in an unjust war, there is no legal freedom available for you if that's your situation. It's jail or war against your conscience. And I want to tell you something. I'm on the planning committee of Under the Hood Cafe. I spend a lot of time, and also with Stand With Honor, interviewing guys who are really struggling with their conscience. When we look at the PTSD, when we look at the suicides, you know, the last few years, more of our troops have died of suicide than have been killed in combat. And that's only counting the ones still actively serving, not counting the vets who have gotten out. You know, I fell on my ass when I heard this a few years ago. We lost over 59,000 troops in Vietnam. More Vietnam veterans have died of suicide than the Vietnam War. That's not counting the men that drank themselves to death. So, this war could end tomorrow. People would still be dying. People are struggling with their conscience. They're struggling with PTSD. They're struggling with the moral injury. Here's the question. What is easier to do for the rest of your life when you look in the mirror? Live with a dishonorable discharge in jail for standing by your conscience, or live with a violated, sacred sense of honor and conscience because you did something that went against your heart?